March 6, 1944. Dawn seeped over the hills of northern Burma like pale fire spilling through jungle mist. The monsoon season had turned every track into a ribbon of treacherous mud, a glistening brown trap that swallowed carts and oxen whole. In the dripping half-light, the Japanese patrol crouched along the edge of a ravine, eyes narrowed, rifles balanced in mud-slick hands. They were veterans of the Arakan campaign, hardened men who had marched thousands of miles through malarial jungles. They thought they understood the terrain's cruelty. But this morning something alien crept up the mountain trail below them, something that defied the jungle itself. At first came the sound, low and irregular, like muted thunder wrapped in cloth. The mist shifted. Engines. Not the lumbering growl of tanks or the clattering of half-tracks, but a brisk, even heartbeat of machines. The Japanese corporal peered through his field glasses. Where his instincts expected elephants or mules, he caught sight of silhouettes. Squat, angular metal beasts no larger than a rickshaw, but moving with a speed that mocked the mud. The vehicles were painted olive drab, their canvas tops rolled back, their windscreens flecked with rain and grit. They were jeeps, but to the men on the ridge they looked like demons with wheels. The patrol leader muttered a prayer under his breath. The mud should have stopped them. Every Japanese supply line in this theater had been strangled by the monsoon's grip. Yet the American machines advanced, bouncing like wild animals, tires churning through the sludge. They cut across the jungle path at an angle no cart or horse could manage, climbing a slope so steep the patrol leader thought it a mistake. But the jeeps did not falter. They moved as though the mud were merely painted on a map. Below, the American drivers sat hunched against the damp air, faces streaked with sweat and rain. One gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. The other held a Thompson submachine gun, pointed at the tree line. Behind them, another jeep followed, then another. A small convoy threading a hidden trail the Japanese had believed impassable. Radio antennas quivered from their rears like the feelers of insects, whispering unheard signals through the static of the jungle. The Japanese corporal could smell the oil and exhaust even at this distance. It reminded him of Shanghai dockyards before the war, where imported vehicles sat stacked on the pier. But this was different. These machines were not cargo. They were predators. Their wheels, thin and knobby, spat out clods of mud yet found traction, where a man's boots sank ankle-deep. Their engines coughed but did not stall. Each time the slope grew sharper, the jeeps lurched forward as though dragged by invisible hands, their chassis flexing, springs groaning. No oxen, no horses, just relentless gasoline-fed motion. He lifted his binoculars again. A logo glinted faintly on a grille. Willys in block letters, meaningless to him yet ominous. He passed the glasses to his sergeant. The sergeant swore. "Impossible," he whispered. The mud had swallowed their own transport 2 days ago. Men had died hauling mortars through waist-deep sludge. Yet here came the enemy, ascending like water spiders. The air itself seemed to tense as the convoy neared the ridge. The Japanese patrol melted into the foliage, watching with wide eyes. A jeep at the front slowed, its driver scanning the trees, then gave a signal with 2 fingers. Instantly the vehicles halted, men fanning out with practiced ease. They moved like one organism, rifles ready, boots barely disturbing the sodden earth. Even as they paused, the engines idled in low growls, ready to surge forward again. For a moment the jungle fell silent except for rain ticking on leaves. Then a burst of radio chatter broke through, crisp, rapid, crackling with confidence. It was an alien sound in this theater, where Japanese units still relied on hand signals and couriers. The Americans spoke in code, their voices steady. Orders flew through the ether, faster than any runner could sprint. The patrol leader realized he was witnessing something new, not just a vehicle, but a way of moving. A doctrine born thousands of miles away and now unleashed on his flank. The corporal's mind flickered back to his training in Kyushu. He had been taught that the jungle was an ally to those who embraced hardship, that technology was shackled by climate. But as he watched the jeeps maneuver, he felt that premise crumble. These were not heavy tanks bogged down by their own armor. These were nimble insects of steel, immune to the jungle's poison. A single jeep veered off the path, plunging into a side gully, and emerged moments later onto higher ground, its tires clawing at roots, its suspensions swallowing the shocks. The driver laughed, or actually laughed, as though conquering terrain was sport. Rain fell harder. A mosquito landed on the corporal's cheek, and he slapped it without looking away. The convoy was unloading supplies now. Crates of ammunition, rolls of radio cable, even a small collapsible bridge that unfolded like a toy. The Americans moved with a choreography that belied their mud-streaked uniforms. They were not just surviving the monsoon, they were exploiting it. The jungle's isolation, which had punished the Japanese, was merely a backdrop for their theater of mobility. Somewhere deep in the trees, a mortar thumped, a Japanese harassing shot fired blind. The shell landed 30 yards from the convoy, kicking up a brown fountain. Instantly, the Americans reacted. 2 jeeps spun in place, their wheels biting mud, while infantry melted into cover. Another jeep revved and surged upslope, vanishing behind a thicket, only to reappear at a flanking angle. The corporal's heart pounded. In minutes, the battlefield had inverted. The enemy was no longer at the bottom of the hill, but on its shoulder. He imagined how this would read in the after-action report. Enemy small vehicles capable of traversing terrain previously deemed impassable. Enemy supply lines remain intact despite monsoon. Morale affected. He could almost hear the bewilderment in his commander's voice. These jeeps were supposed to be auxiliary rear area machines, not frontline predators. Yet here they were, rewriting the map one muddy slope at a time. The jungle dimmed as clouds swallowed the morning sun. The convoy moved again, cresting the hill and disappearing down the far side, leaving only churned earth and a faint smell of gasoline. The Japanese patrol stayed frozen, unsure whether to retreat or pursue. The corporal lowered his binoculars and stared at the mud where the jeeps had passed. Deep but precise tire tracks etched a new geometry into the earth, a signature of something both mundane and revolutionary. He felt a strange chill, not from the rain, but from the future pressing against his present. If such small machines could negate the jungle, then their own supply routes, their ambush tactics, their reliance on terrain, all of it was vulnerable. The Americans had not just brought vehicles. They had brought a new tempo of war. Somewhere far above thunder rolled. Or was it artillery? Hard to tell in the mountains. The corporal signaled his men to fall back, their retreat swallowed by foliage. As they moved, he cast one last look at the churned mud. He would remember that sight for the rest of the war. Little machines climbing a world built to stop them. In that moment under monsoon rain, on a nameless ridge in northern Burma, he glimpsed the shape of defeat. And as the patrol vanished into the jungle, the echo of those engines lingered like a prophecy. A prophecy that the war itself was shifting, that technology and speed would erode every fortress of terrain and tradition. What had seemed impossible at dawn had become undeniable by midday. The jeeps had conquered the mud, and with it, a piece of the Japanese army's confidence. By early 1944, the war in Asia had become a grinding struggle of attrition, fought as much against terrain and weather as against the enemy's bullets. Northern Burma, the sweltering hinge between India and China, was a theater of shadow operations and forgotten campaigns. Japanese forces held the high ground in the arterial roads, confident in their doctrine of endurance and ambush. They had marched across the Malay Peninsula on bicycles and foot, outflanking British strongpoints with unyielding discipline. In their worldview, the jungle was the ultimate fortress, a living moat that would strangle mechanized armies and shield the imperial lines of communication. Yet even as their grip tightened on the ridges and river crossings, a quiet revolution in American mobility was taking root behind the curtain of monsoon rain. This revolution had been gestating for years, long before the jeeps appeared in Burma's mud. In Detroit, Toledo, and other industrial crucibles, engineers and assembly line workers had been perfecting machines designed not for battlefields, but for the farms, trails, and depots of peacetime America. Light, small, and quick to build, these vehicles could be transported by ship or glider, dropped onto beaches or airstrips with minimal preparation. When war came, the U.S. military grasped their potential with both hands, reshaping tactics around their mobility. Unlike the Japanese, who prized spiritual resilience and infantry-centric operations, the Americans were learning to wage war as an orchestra of movement and communication, each note connected by steel and radio waves. The larger context was grim. After the Japanese victories of 1941 and 1942, Allied morale in Southeast Asia had been shredded. The fall of Singapore, The humiliation at Hong Kong and the retreat from Burma had carved deep scars. By 1943, however, the tide was beginning to turn. American industrial might surged like a tide across two oceans. Tanks, aircraft, and landing craft rolled off production lines in numbers that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. But perhaps most transformative was not the heavy weaponry, but the infrastructure of movement. Standardized vehicles, field radios, and a doctrine of flexible logistics. This invisible architecture of war was about to collide with the Imperial Army's assumptions about terrain. The Japanese army had been schooled on lessons from the Russo-Japanese War and the conquest of Manchuria, where infantry and artillery, painstakingly maneuvered, could crush superior opponents. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, their reliance on human porters and captured infrastructure had initially paid off. Supply lines were lean. Soldiers carried what they needed. They marched for weeks with little support, appearing where the British thought no army could go. But by 1944, the Americans and their British and Chinese allies were turning that logic inside out. Instead of avoiding the jungle, they would drive through it. Instead of surrendering to the monsoon, they would bring machines designed to master it. The Allied plan for the northern Burma theater called for the construction of new roads and airstrips, linking India to China via the Lido Road and the Hump airlift. This required not only engineering brigades, but a constant stream of supplies delivered along paths barely worthy of the name. The Jeep, officially the 14-ton 4-4 truck, became the sinew binding these efforts together. Light enough to cross bamboo bridges, powerful enough to haul mortars and radios, and small enough to hide beneath jungle canopy, it could go where heavier trucks bogged down. In this way, the Americans began to invert the Japanese narrative of terrain dominance. Everywhere, the contrast in doctrine was stark. Japanese units still relied on runners to pass orders, on hand signals and shouted commands in the din of battle. Their trucks were heavier, fewer, and more vulnerable to breakdown. Horses and oxen carried much of their ammunition, slowing convoys to the pace of foot soldiers. By contrast, American formations glided across the mud in jeeps, half-tracks, and modified carriers. Orders transmitted by FM radio allowed dispersed units to coordinate ambushes, retreats, and supply drops with a speed that defied the jungle's maze. Even the psychology of movement was changing. In Japanese doctrine, a soldier's endurance was a weapon and suffering proved superiority. In the American approach, machines carried the burden, freeing soldiers to fight with fresh legs and clearer minds. The Jeep was not glamorous like a tank, but it represented a shift from human muscle to mechanical nerve, a portable nervous system of war. As these vehicles infiltrated the Burmese hills, Japanese commanders began receiving reports of phantom units appearing behind their lines, supplied and reinforced faster than seemed possible. By mid-1944, Allied forces under General Joseph Stilwell and British-led Chindit operations were pushing deep into territories once thought impregnable. Small mobile columns penetrated the jungle, guided by radio and supported by airdrops, their jeeps hidden under camouflage netting until the moment to strike. Japanese outposts, accustomed to weeks of isolation, suddenly found themselves under coordinated assaults from multiple directions. The old certainties that the jungle slowed everyone equally, that monsoon season was a lull in operations, were evaporating. The Americans and their allies had discovered a tempo of war the Japanese could not match. On the ground, this shift looked deceptively simple, a handful of light vehicles crawling up muddy trails. But in reality it was the visible edge of a vast, unseen system, factories churning out spare parts, convoys delivering fuel, engineers cutting new roads with bulldozers, code clerks maintaining radio nets that spanned hundreds of miles. This system enabled not just mobility, but persistence. Where a Japanese unit might exhaust itself, hauling supplies through swamps, an American column could establish a forward base, resupply it by air, and keep rolling. For the Japanese soldiers watching jeeps claw up a mountainside, this was not an abstract doctrinal shift, but a visceral shock. They saw a weapon of war that violated the unwritten rules of their theater. Vehicles were supposed to be trapped on the few existing roads, predictable and easy to ambush. Yet these olive-drab phantoms came slashing through the underbrush, over ground too soft for mules. Their tires gripped clay like hands. Their engines, though small, roared with stubborn vitality. Each sighting of a jeep in impossible terrain was a psychological blow, eroding confidence in the Imperial Army's mastery of the jungle. The stage, then, was set for a confrontation between two worldviews, one of discipline, endurance and terrain-based defense, the other of technology, speed and integrated command. As the spring rains of 1944 deepened the mud, the Americans did not pause. They accelerated. The Jeep, that unassuming machine born of peacetime contracts and industrial pragmatism, had become the spear point of an entirely new kind of warfare in Southeast Asia. And so, even before the first decisive clashes erupted, the mood among Japanese officers grew taut. Reports filtered up of American columns appearing where no road existed, of radio-directed artillery strikes falling on hidden camps, of supply caches captured mere hours after being established. Something was moving in the jungle, not on foot but on wheels, and its arrival would mark the end of the old war and the beginning of the new. They called it the Little Truck, but the truth was far stranger than the nickname implied. Hidden within its stubby frame and stripped-down body lay an advantage the Japanese had not anticipated, a synthesis of mobility and communication that transformed every jeep from a simple vehicle into a roving nerve cell of the Allied army. In the heat and damp of northern Burma, where the enemy trusted the mud to slow invaders into exhaustion, these machines whispered a different story, one of relentless advance, coordinated with unseen hands. This was the hidden advantage that bewildered patrols and confounded commanders, not a secret weapon in the conventional sense, but a doctrine wrapped in steel, rubber, and radio waves. The Jeep itself was a paradox. It looked too small to matter, its slab sides and open cockpit exposed like a toy left in the rain. Yet it possessed the agility of a mountain goat and the heart of a workhorse. Its four-wheel drive system, borrowed from pre-war engineering dreams, gave it traction on slopes that defeated larger trucks. Its short wheelbase allowed sudden turns on jungle tracks narrower than a man's shoulders. Above all, its standardized parts and interchangeable components meant repairs could be done in the field with the simplest of tools, keeping the fleet alive far from supply depots. Japanese troops saw only the outer shape, a stripped vehicle bouncing up hills, but they were really witnessing the front edge of a logistical miracle. At the core of this advantage was communication. Each jeep could carry a radio set, sometimes even multiple sets, that linked forward scouts to artillery, engineers to air support, medics to evacuation points. The jungle, which normally shredded human voices into echoes, could not stop the carrier waves humming through the canopy. This network created a battlefield map in motion, a grid of moving nodes that could converge, disperse, or redirect at will. To the Japanese accustomed to rigid, prearranged plans and signal flags, it appeared as though the Americans anticipated their every move. In truth, the Americans were simply talking to one another faster than the enemy could act. The surprise deepened because of how these advantages intertwined. Mobility alone would have been frustrating but manageable. The Japanese had countermeasures for tanks and trucks. Radio alone could be jammed or intercepted. But when lightweight vehicles married four-wheel drive to real-time communication, the effect was exponential. A column of jeeps could probe multiple paths, radio back obstacles, and reroute before the Japanese even realized contact had been made. The monsoon mud, once a natural ally of defenders, became a camouflage for attackers who appeared where they were least expected. Consider the contrast with the Imperial Army's own transport. Japanese forces relied heavily on pack animals and foot soldiers to ferry mortars, ammunition, and rations across jungle trails. Even when they had trucks, these were mostly rear-echelon assets, underpowered and ill-suited for off-road climbs. Radios were scarce and often low-powered, prone to static in heavy rain, and tied to specific command posts. Orders filtered down through couriers who might take hours to cross a mile of flooded jungle. By the time a Japanese commander learned of an incursion, the jeeps had vanished, their mission complete. To the American soldiers, the jeep was more than transport. It was a fighting platform, a supply mule, a command post, and a symbol of ingenuity. They mounted machine guns on its roll bars, stretched camouflage nets over its body, and lashed stretchers to its sides for wounded comrades. It was cheap enough to risk, durable enough to endure, and small enough to conceal. Each adaptation magnified its battlefield presence. The Japanese, encountering one version one day and another the next, struggled to understand how many types of vehicles they were facing. They began reporting light tanks or fast-armored cars where there were only jeeps with improvised armor plates or heavy weapons bolted to their frames. Yet the jeep's greatest weapon was invisibility in plain sight, not cloaking but normalcy. It did not thunder like a Sherman or squeal like a half-track. It had blended with the forest noise, slipping into ravines or across rice paddies with a rooster tail of mud but little fanfare. This allowed Allied units to infiltrate deep behind Japanese lines, establish forward observation posts, and call down artillery or airstrikes from unexpected angles. Japanese scouts often mistook tire tracks for the remnants of local carts, not realizing a mobile strike team had passed through hours earlier. Behind all this lay an American approach to war that prized innovation and adaptation. The Jeep had been born of a crash program in 1940, when the U.S. Army solicited bids for a light reconnaissance vehicle. Willys Overland and Ford answered with prototypes that combined speed, ruggedness, and simplicity. By 1942, production was in full swing, and by 1943 these vehicles were flowing to every theater of war. In Europe, they carried paratroopers across French hedgerows. In Africa, they hauled supplies over desert dunes. In Burma, they became something stranger still, amphibious trailblazers, able to outclimb the enemy's expectations as easily as they outdrove their supply lines. The Japanese soldiers who watched them ascend muddy slopes were thus not just facing a machine, but an entire system of war. The jeeps were supported by airdrops of fuel, by maintenance teams who could rebuild an engine in hours, and by a doctrine that treated mobility as a weapon equal to firepower. When a jeep broke down, another replaced it. When a route collapsed, bulldozers cut a new one. No single obstacle could stop the flow. For men trained to measure victory by the suffering they could impose on an enemy, it was disorienting to see that suffering absorbed by machines rather than human backs. Psychologically, this hidden advantage struck at the heart of Japanese confidence. Imperial propaganda had promised that their soldiers' spiritual superiority would outlast Western machines. Yet here in the steaming jungle, the machines were not just enduring but thriving, dancing over terrain that swallowed animals and men alike. Each jeep that appeared on an impossible track whispered a new message. The world was shrinking, and with it the refuge of tradition. Even Japanese officers who had studied abroad were baffled by the Americans' ability to mass-produce and distribute these vehicles. Intelligence reports underestimated their numbers, assuming such feats of mobility were the work of elite units. In reality, jeeps were ubiquitous, the connective tissue of an army whose doctrine depended on every unit moving, speaking, and fighting as one. This invisibility of abundance made them seem supernatural. A destroyed jeep would be replaced overnight. A lost patrol would be reinforced from an unexpected direction. The Japanese could never be sure how many enemies lurked beyond the next ridge. This hidden advantage also extended beyond the battlefield into morale. American troops who rode in jeeps felt less isolated, less burdened by the terrain. They could carry more ammunition, more food, more radios. They arrived fresher to fight, evacuated wounded faster, and maintained a rhythm of contact that unnerved defenders accustomed to long pauses between engagements. The jungle that had been a moat became a highway, and in doing so, it inverted the psychological equation of the war. By the time Japanese commanders began to grasp the scale of this transformation, it was too late. The jeeps had already redrawn the operational map. Roads no longer defined avenues of advance. Rivers no longer blocked supply. Even mountains could be skirted or climbed with improvised ramps and winches. The hidden advantage, the fusion of mobility, communication, and industrial scale, was now an open wound in the Imperial Army's defenses. In this way, a small, boxy vehicle and its crackling radio set had achieved what artillery bombardments and massed infantry had not. It had shaken the very assumptions of the Japanese war effort. It taught the Allied soldiers that speed and coordination could overcome geography, and it taught the Japanese that no fortress of terrain was truly unbreachable. What began as a minor logistical innovation had blossomed into a strategic revolution one whose consequences would soon be felt in every skirmish and campaign across the jungles of Southeast Asia. Beneath its unassuming skin, the Jeep was a symphony of purposeful engineering, a compact answer to the jungle's riddle. Its four-cylinder Go Devil engine, built by Willys Overland, produced just 60 horsepower, yet through careful gearing, it could pull more than twice its own weight. The entire vehicle weighed around 2,150 pounds loaded, a feather compared to the lumbering Japanese Type 94 trucks that tipped the scales at over 6,000 pounds. This gave it a power-to-weight ratio that seemed almost uncanny, like a small animal outmuscling a predator. Its transfer case enabled high and low ranges, its axles locked in constant four-wheel drive, and its suspension flexed like a living spine over roots and stones. The result was not speed alone, but tenacity, the ability to maintain momentum in terrain designed to stop machines dead. Every line of its frame reflected wartime pragmatism. The flat fenders doubled as seats, the hood as a workbench. The windshield folded down to reduce glare or serve as an impromptu map table. The steering column was nearly vertical, mimicking the feel of civilian trucks so soldiers could adapt quickly. Even the placement of the fuel tank under the driver's seat had a reason, a low center of gravity that kept the Jeep from tipping on steep inclines. None of these features dazzled on their own, but together they forged a vehicle whose spirit matched its soldiers. Adaptable, resilient, unpretentious. In Burma's mud, tire choice could mean the difference between survival and immobilization. The Jeep's 6-point Rec 16 NDT, non-directional tread tires, were a subtle revolution. Their blocky, symmetrical pattern allowed equal grip in forward and reverse, critical when retreating from a failed ascent. Japanese trucks, by contrast, often used directional or road-optimized treads that clogged with clay. Allied mechanics would sometimes air down the Jeep's tires, reducing pressure to increase contact patch and traction, a trick borrowed from off-road racers back home. This attention to detail turned each muddy slope into a test the Jeep was designed to pass, but mobility was only half the story. The other half lay in the radio sets these Jeeps carried like invisible weapons. Among the most common was the SCR 510 and its vehicular cousin, the SCR 610, frequency-modulated FM transceivers operating between 27.0 and 38.9 MHz. Each weighed around 55 pounds, a marvel compared to the heavier, static-prone sets of earlier campaigns. FM technology, relatively new to the battlefield, rejected static and atmospheric noise that plagued amplitude-modulated AM radios, especially in thunderstorms and tropical heat. Where Japanese Fuji or Type 94 radios sputtered under monsoon interference, the American sets purred with clarity. Range was roughly 8 to 15 miles vehicle to vehicle, extendable with relays, enough to knit together an entire dispersed column in real time. The marriage of Jeep and radio was deliberate. The dashboard bristled with power takeoffs and mounting brackets. A whip antenna rose from the rear like a flagpole, flexing under branches but never snapping. Soldiers could dismount the set in minutes, using it as a field station if the vehicle had to retreat. This modularity created a seamless flow of information between moving units and static command posts. Even artillery fire, once a blunt instrument in jungle fighting, could be guided with surgical precision thanks to forward observers perched in Jeeps with radios and binoculars. From the factories of the American Midwest to the mud tracks of Burma, the Jeep's production story mirrored its battlefield performance. Willys Overland and Ford churned out nearly 650,000 units during the war, each standardized so parts were interchangeable regardless of manufacturer. A transmission from a Ford GPW could slot into a Willys MB without modification. A fender from one could bolt onto the other. This interchangeability meant Allied supply depots didn't need to hoard obscure spares. In the jungle, where supply convoys were thin lifelines, that simplicity saved lives. A mechanic could cannibalize one wrecked Jeep to keep two more running, an impossible task with the patchwork of Japanese vehicles scavenged from civilian stocks. Even its fuel requirements reflected foresight. The Jeep's engine could run on low-octane gasoline, the kind available in remote theaters. Japanese trucks often demanded higher quality fuel or maintenance-intensive carburetors. Where Allied supply lines faltered, Jeeps kept running on whatever they could siphon from drums or airstrip caches. This ruggedness was not an accident, but the product of relentless testing at Fort Holabird and Camp Holabird, where prototypes were driven until frames cracked and axles snapped. Only the strongest designs survived to reach the battlefield. Engineers also designed the Jeep with an eye toward modular warfare. It could be lifted by glider or plane, slung under cranes or ferried across rivers on pontoons. In Burma, engineers built rafts from oil drums to float columns of Jeeps across flooded valleys. Some Jeeps were fitted with deep-water fording kits, extending their exhaust and intake to wade through swamps chest-high on a man. Others carried light recoilless rifles or heavy radios, transforming overnight from transport to weapon or command node. This ability to morph roles meant no Japanese outpost could predict what a Jeep approaching their perimeter might carry. Japanese engineers, by contrast, had never invested heavily in a single universal vehicle. Their army relied on a scatter of trucks, many built under license from European designs of the 1930s. Maintenance was a nightmare, spare parts inconsistent, and four-wheel drive rare. Radios were precious enough to hoard at regimental level, leaving frontline companies in communicative darkness. This technological lag was not due to ignorance, but to industrial limits. Japan simply could not mass-produce standardized machines at American scales, while also feeding its Navy and Air Force. Thus, each Jeep on a Burmese trail was both a tactical presence and an industrial echo of American factories thousands of miles away. Technological superiority also extended to repair doctrine. American motor pools followed the echelon system, dividing maintenance into levels from field fixes to depot overhauls. Soldiers learned basic repairs as part of their training. Manuals came with diagrams clear enough for a farmhand to follow. Japanese doctrine assumed dedicated mechanics would handle repairs, but shortages and attrition left many units without specialists. In the field, a broken axle could immobilize a Japanese truck for weeks. An American Jeep with a cracked axle might be rolling again by dusk, thanks to cannibalized parts or airdropped spares. Even the Jeep's speed of deployment shaped strategy. A battalion of Jeeps could be offloaded from a Liberty ship in hours, drive directly onto rough ground, and disperse before enemy reconnaissance spotted them. Japanese reinforcements, by contrast, slogged by foot or waited for a few vulnerable barges. This discrepancy compressed time and space on the battlefield, allowing Allied commanders to think in days while their opponents planned in weeks. In the end, the Jeep was less a vehicle than a platform, a rolling testbed of 20th century warfighting principles. Its steel channels and rivets carried not just soldiers, but an idea that mobility and information could outflank mass and tradition. Its specs, so humble on paper, hid a capacity to transform logistics into strategy, tactics into movement. Each climbing of a muddy slope in Burma was not a random feat of engineering, but the physical manifestation of a doctrine born in American factories and classrooms, carried into the jungle on four-driven wheels. To the Japanese soldier squinting through mist at an approaching convoy, none of this was visible. He saw only a boxy silhouette jolting over rocks, its antenna twitching. But in that silhouette lay a century's leap forward. It was the sound of gears meshing, of radios crackling, of an industrial empire projecting itself into a place where even elephants hesitated. And with each new mile of impossible terrain conquered, the Jeep revealed that the age of purely human endurance had given way to the age of mechanized agility, a truth as unstoppable as the machine itself. September 12, 1944, dawn crept over the Hukong Valley, like a blade of light slicing the monsoon haze. The jungle canopy dripped with last night's rain, every leaf trembling as if under the weight of a secret. Somewhere beyond the tangled vines and half-collapsed trails, a Japanese garrison lay hidden, its trenches dug into the mud of an old logging camp. For weeks they had watched Allied columns inch closer, probing the valley with reconnaissance patrols, cutting new tracks where none had existed. Yet still the garrison commander believed the monsoon would halt the advance. His men stood ready with mortars and machine guns, their rifles wrapped in oiled cloth, their supply mules tethered under makeshift shelters. They were veterans of Kohima and Imphal, confident the jungle would smother the enemy as it had smothered so many before. But this morning the jungle was restless. The rain's rhythm was broken by a sound alien to their ears, low, throaty engines echoing up from the valley floor, not the laboring chug of a truck, but the confident pulse of something smaller, faster. The commander adjusted his binoculars, scanning the trails where his scouts had reported washed-out bridges and waist-deep bogs. There should have been nothing but mud and water. Instead, movement. First one, then two, then a whole line of jeeps appearing like ghosts from the foliage, their hoods glistening with moisture, their antennas swaying like reeds. The Americans were moving in columns of three, each jeep separated by a gap just wide enough to allow sudden turns into the underbrush. Canvas-topped trailers bounced behind them, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and collapsible steel mats for instant road building. Forward scouts rode in the first vehicles, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping carbines or Thompsons. Their faces were mud-streaked but calm. Radios crackled faintly, sending coded bursts to artillery batteries hidden miles away. Even as they advanced, engineers dismounted to cut back vines and lay planks over the deepest puddles. It was not a march. It was an unfolding of infrastructure in real time. The Japanese defenders had mined the obvious approaches, expecting heavy trucks or at best mule columns. But the jeeps veered off the mapped tracks, climbing over knotted roots and sliding down embankments like steel beetles. They splashed through streams without slowing, their exhausts bubbling underwater. Machine gun teams scrambled to reposition, but each time they set up, the jeeps appeared from a new direction as if multiplied by the jungle itself. Mortar crews fired blindly, shells thumping into trees, but the Americans were already elsewhere, guided by radio to skirt danger and strike weak points. At 0800 hours, the first contact erupted. A Jeep-mounted .30 caliber machine gun opened fire from a rise, cutting through the fog and raking a Japanese outpost. Almost simultaneously, another Jeep on the opposite flank unleashed its fire. A crossfire from two vehicles that had arrived by trails no map recorded. Japanese soldiers dove for cover, only to find the Americans shifting again, tires grinding, radios buzzing. This was not the slow, grinding assault of British columns or the predictable advance of tanks on a road. This was a swarm, coordinated and lethal. Each unit an eye and a fist connected to a larger brain. By mid-morning, the Japanese commander tried to rally his men for a counterattack. He dispatched a platoon to flank the Americans, but the jungle betrayed his plan. Allied observers, perched in jeeps fitted with long-range radios and telescopic sights, spotted the movement and relayed coordinates. Minutes later, artillery shells whistled down from beyond the hills, turning the counterattack into a blur of mud and fire. The commander realized too late that the jeeps were not just transport. They were forward observation posts guiding unseen guns. His flanking force had never stood a chance. Inside the valley, the battle became a series of fluid skirmishes. A jeep would dart forward, disgorge a fire team, then pivot back into the trees. Another would haul up a mortar, its crew laying rounds within minutes. Casualties among the Americans were light. Evacuation jeeps ferried the wounded to rear areas faster than stretchers could have. Japanese casualties mounted as their positions were flanked and overrun. The mud that had once been their ally now served as the Americans' camouflage, muffling the sound of engines, masking their approach until the moment of attack. By noon, Allied engineers had transformed the battlefield. Using the trailers and jeeps, they laid down metal planking over the worst bogs, creating instant roads for heavier support weapons. A small bulldozer, towed in pieces by jeeps and assembled under camouflage netting, widened the path for incoming supplies. Japanese observers watched in disbelief as an entire logistics hub seemed to materialize from the jungle floor, fed by a steady trickle of jeeps carrying everything from water cans to radio batteries. Their own supply line, dependent on mule trains and porters slogging through knee-deep muck, seemed medieval by comparison. Reports from surviving Japanese soldiers spoke of confusion and dread. The enemy vehicles climbed the hill like crabs, one wrote later in his diary, their wheels throwing mud but never stopping. Another described the jeeps as small tanks with wings, able to vanish and reappear unpredictably. Rumors spread that the Americans had trained special drivers who could see through trees, or that the vehicles were fitted with secret tracks under their tires. In reality, it was no secret at all. Just four-wheel drive, careful planning, and a radio network that turned chaos into choreography. As dusk fell, the Hukong Valley engagement reached its climax. The jeeps had encircled the Japanese garrison, sealing off its escape routes. Airborne supplies dropped into the clearing captured earlier in the day, further tightening the noose. When the Americans launched their final assault at 1800 hours, it came from three sides at once, each wave guided by real-time updates from jeep-mounted radios. Caught between collapsing lines and artillery strikes, the Japanese garrison broke. Some tried to flee into the jungle, only to find blocking forces already in place. Others fought to the last, their bayonet charges drowned in machine gun fire from jeeps parked at cross angles. By nightfall, the camp was in Allied hands. The jeeps, mud-caked and dented, lined up under the dripping trees, their engines ticking softly as they cooled. Soldiers stripped off wet uniforms, lit cigarettes and tended to the wounded. Mechanics crawled under chassis with wrenches, already preparing for the next day's push. In a makeshift command post, an officer traced new routes on a map, confident now that the valley's terrain no longer dictated the campaign's pace. The Americans had written a new template for jungle warfare, one tire track at a time. The Hukong Valley battle became a whisper among Japanese survivors, a warning passed along with rations and orders. "Beware the little trucks," they told one another. "They are faster than rivers." Intelligence reports sent back to Rangoon described a force that seemed to multiply in the mud, appearing where no vehicle could go, carrying radios that summoned invisible guns. The old certainties that the monsoon was an ally, that terrain would break mechanization, were gone. In their place stood a new fear, that every ridgeline concealed a path, and every path a convoy of jeeps, advancing with an inevitability no weather could stop. What made the battle extraordinary was not its scale but its symbolism. Here in a forgotten corner of the Burma campaign, the jeep had proven itself not just a convenience, but a weapon of maneuver. It had outclimbed hills, outlasted storms, and outthought an enemy accustomed to static lines. Where traditional offensives bogged down, the jeeps had flowed. Where defenders prepared for one direction, the attack had come from three. It was mobility weaponized, industrial power condensed into a four-wheeled frame. As night deepened, fireflies blinked over the captured camp, their light mingling with the dim glow of American lanterns. In the silence after battle, the jeeps stood like squat sentinels, engines cooling, radios murmuring faintly with distant voices. For the men who had fought from their seats, steering wheels slick with rain and sweat, the little machine had become something more than steel. It was the bridge between worlds, between the factory floor in Ohio and the muddy ridge in Burma, between the past of foot-bound armies and the future of mechanized swarms. And in that valley on that day, it had written its legend in mud and steel, one impossible climb at a time. Across the jungles of Southeast Asia, word of the Hukong Valley engagement spread like damp smoke. Japanese commanders who had once scoffed at Allied mobility now pored over intelligence reports with clenched jaws, searching for patterns in the chaos. They found only one constant. Wherever the small American vehicles appeared, their defensive lines buckled faster than doctrine could explain. It was not simply the physical arrival of jeeps, but the aura they carried, a sense that the jungle had been compromised, its natural barriers breached. Strategically and psychologically, the advantage tilted as surely as a seesaw shifting under new weight. Terrain no longer belonged to the defenders. It belonged to those who could move through it, connect within it, and act faster than an opponent could react. At the strategic level, the jeep's presence redrew maps and timetables. Before its arrival, Allied operations in northern Burma were constrained by foot marches and mule trains, bound to predictable supply routes. Afterward, columns could leapfrog forward, establishing new positions ahead of Japanese expectations. An advance that once required a week could now be executed in days. This compressed timeline forced Japanese units into a reactive posture, their carefully laid ambushes neutralized before they could spring. Each failed ambush bled not only manpower but morale, undermining the belief that discipline and suffering alone could offset industrial power. On the ground, the psychological shift was even more profound. For Japanese infantrymen, trained to endure deprivation and isolation, the sudden appearance of jeeps felt like a violation of nature. In their training manuals, monsoon mud was described as a moat, a living ally that would sap enemy strength. Seeing American vehicles plow through that moat cracked a pillar of their faith. The mud had betrayed them. The jungle had been tamed. Soldiers began reporting phantom convoys and exaggerated enemy numbers, symptoms of a force under mounting stress. In letters home, survivors wrote of iron crabs and ghost trucks appearing out of mist, metaphors of a machine that eroded not just ground, but confidence. For the Americans and their allies, the effect was the reverse. Mobility bred cohesion. Riding in jeeps, soldiers felt connected to a larger machine, their radios a lifeline to unseen support. This sense of belonging countered the jungle's isolation, bolstering morale even in the face of tropical disease and constant rain. Evacuation of wounded became quicker, supply of hot meals more reliable, and reinforcements more predictable. In a theater where morale was as vital as bullets, the jeep transformed the psychology of the fight, turning dread into momentum. Commanders on both sides recognized the ripple effects. Allied leaders began designing operations around the jeep's capabilities, planning routes through previously ignored terrain, counting on rapid resupply and evacuation to sustain deeper thrusts. Japanese officers, by contrast, found their options shrinking. To counter jeep-borne units, they would have to disperse their forces, yet dispersion weakened their defense and stretched their own thin logistics further. Concentrating for an ambush invited encirclement by mobile flanking forces. The Imperial Army's playbook, honed in China and Malaya, began to fray in the Burmese hills. The psychological toll on Japanese crews and commanders echoed older military shocks, like the first appearance of tanks in 1916 or Blitzkrieg in 1940. It was not merely the physical damage, but the revelation that old assumptions no longer applied. Trenches had failed against armor. Static defense was failing against mechanized swarms. As one captured Japanese lieutenant reportedly told interrogators, "It was as if the earth itself had turned against us. Roads appeared where none were. Enemy fire came from angles no map showed." This confession reflected a larger truth. By mastering mobility and communication, the Americans had weaponized unpredictability. This new tempo also reshaped the larger Allied campaign. The jeep's ability to carry radios meant artillery and air support could be called with unprecedented precision. Japanese strongpoints, once safe behind jungle screens, could be mapped, shelled, and assaulted within hours. The tempo of combined arms accelerated. The gap between spotting and striking shrank. The Imperial Army, still reliant on delayed courier reports, could not match this rhythm. Every day the psychological gap widened. American soldiers began to believe they could go anywhere. Japanese soldiers began to believe nowhere was safe. Beyond tactics, the jeep symbolized a doctrine of integration, technology, logistics, and human capital functioning as a single organism. This integration mirrored industrial America itself, where assembly lines produced standardized parts and workers specialized in interlocking tasks. In Burma, the battlefield version of that assembly line allowed dispersed units to act as one. Japanese forces, lacking comparable infrastructure, found themselves in a contest between a network and a series of isolated nodes. The network won, even whether, once the great equalizer, became a weapon in Allied hands. When the monsoon swelled rivers and deepened mud, Japanese units hunkered down, expecting a pause in fighting. Instead, jeeps arrived at their flanks, supplied by air and supported by mobile engineers. Attacks came in conditions once deemed impossible, amplifying shock. The psychological whiplash, waiting for a lull and receiving an assault, frayed discipline and heightened exhaustion. Soldiers manning outposts in the hills began firing at shadows, convinced that every rustle heralded another jeep-borne raid. Among Allied troops, the jeep fostered a sense of autonomy. Small teams could venture deep into enemy territory, with confidence that they could retreat or be reinforced swiftly. This empowerment unleashed a breed of junior leaders, comfortable improvising. A stark contrast to the rigid hierarchies of Japanese units. Radios made coordination fluid. Jeeps made movement instant. Together they produced a battlefield environment where initiative flourished, a key advantage in jungle warfare where central command was often blind. As the months passed, the strategic consequences became evident. Japanese units, forced to stretch their supply lines and disperse for security, weakened under constant harassment. Allied forces, moving faster and striking deeper, captured key river crossings and high ground, unraveling the defensive lattice. The Jeep was not the only factor. Air power, intelligence, and code-breaking all played roles, but it was the most visible sign of a war tilting toward mechanized agility. Each time a Japanese position fell, the victors arrived in a cloud of mud and exhaust, the little trucks leading the way. Psychologically, the cumulative effect on the Imperial Army was corrosive. Confidence, once a bedrock of their training, eroded into fatalism. Veterans who had marched across Malaya now stared at tire tracks cutting through terrain they had deemed impassable. Officers who had preached that spirit conquers steel now watched their best troops outmaneuvered by steel on wheels. In private councils, some admitted that the Americans had changed the nature of the fight, turning the jungle into an arena for machines rather than men. And yet, in that transformation, lay a deeper lesson. The Jeep had not negated courage or endurance. It had redefined how those qualities were applied. American soldiers still endured the same rain and malaria, but their machines carried part of the burden. Japanese soldiers still fought with valor, but without equivalent tools their valor turned to attrition. This asymmetry of means reshaped the moral terrain as surely as it reshaped the physical one. It taught one side to believe in momentum and the other to fear it. By late 1944, the psychological impact of the Jeep was visible even in captured documents. Sketches of American vehicles appeared in training pamphlets. Officers urged their men to destroy Jeeps at all costs, to sever the Allied network node by node. Yet such efforts were mostly symbolic. The Jeeps multiplied faster than they could be eliminated. They had become the signature of an unstoppable tide, as intrinsic to Allied operations as the thunder of bombers or the wake of naval convoys. In Burma's mud and mist, they were more than machines. They were harbingers of a new kind of war, one in which the mind broke before the line did. And so the strategic and psychological impact of the Jeep extended far beyond its four wheels. It collapsed distance, dissolved isolation, and inverted assumptions. It gave the Allies the ability to move like water through a forest of stone, and it left the Japanese army grappling with a future it could not yet name. In every churned path and every startled patrol, the little vehicle carried not just soldiers, but the inevitability of change, a lesson as profound as any written in the smoke of battle. In the months and years that followed the Hukong Valley push, the little American Jeeps rolled on, their legend hardening like steel in the furnace of memory. Veterans spoke of them not as machines, but as companions, mud-splattered silhouettes that arrived with supplies, ammunition, or a ride out of hell. Japanese survivors, meanwhile, recalled the moment they realized the jungle was no longer theirs, when a machine the size of a farmer's cart became the spear point of an industrial colossus. This dual memory would echo into the post-war decades, shaping how armies and nations thought about movement, connection, and the invisible threads of command. By war's end, more than 600,000 Jeeps had been built, a number that dwarfed the armored vehicle output of entire empires. Factories in Toledo, Dearborn, and Detroit had churned them out with clockwork precision, scattering them across every front: deserts, islands, cities, snowfields. Yet Burma remained a proving ground unlike any other. There in mud and monsoon, the Jeep proved a universal truth. The army that can move, communicate, and adapt faster writes the rules of the battlefield. Firepower mattered, but it was secondary to the ability to appear where the enemy least expected. To knit together scattered men into a single fighting organism, the Japanese army would struggle to translate this lesson in time. In post-war interrogations, Imperial staff officers spoke with rueful admiration about the American small vehicle. One described it as an army in miniature, the point where radio, logistics, and initiative converged. Another conceded that their own planning had been shackled to pre-war assumptions about terrain and manpower. "We believed the earth itself would stop them," he said, "but their wheels rolled over our beliefs." Such statements revealed not only a tactical defeat, but an ideological one. The Jeep symbolized the collapse of the idea that determination alone could trump industrial modernity. In the emerging Cold War, the lesson took on new urgency. NATO armies embraced mobility and communications as central tenets, fielding fleets of lightweight vehicles, helicopters, and later digital networks designed to replicate the Jeep's wartime advantage on a global scale. In Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf, U.S. forces built on this foundation. using agile transport and real-time coordination to offset enemy numbers or terrain. The little four-wheel drive that had startled Japanese soldiers in Burma became the ancestor of doctrines that prized speed over mass, connectivity over sheer firepower. Its DNA can be traced through to Humvees, Strykers, and today's drone swarms. Beyond military doctrine, the Jeep became a cultural symbol of freedom and reach. Photographs of GIs perched on hoods, cigarettes dangling, radios squawking, captured a new archetype of soldiering, one defined less by trench mud than by movement. Veterans returning home often bought civilian versions, carrying into peacetime the sense of autonomy and mechanical trust forged in war. In Japan, decades later, the memory of those little trucks lingers in memoirs and films, a reminder of how profoundly they shifted the perception of American power from distant threat to unstoppable presence. Technically, the Jeep's legacy also reshaped how armies approached industrial design. Its simple chassis and standardized parts showed that ruggedness and repairability could be more decisive than armor thickness. Its integration of communications gear prefigured today's network-centric warfare, where every platform, from foot soldier to satellite, is a node in a larger web. In a sense, the Jeep foreshadowed a future where the battlefield itself would become a network, and the winner would be the side that could flow information and material across it without friction. For the men who fought in the Hukong Valley and places like it, the legacy was more intimate. Many remembered the first time they felt the Jeep lurch beneath them, mud spraying, engine snarling, the impossible made ordinary. They remembered hearing a radio crackle with orders from miles away, the sudden reassurance that they were not alone. In contrast, Japanese veterans recalled the helplessness of watching an enemy multiply, their own lines splintered by vehicles appearing from nowhere. That emotional divide, connection versus isolation, speed versus stasis, would remain one of the war's starkest contrasts. History's larger arc vindicated the little vehicle. The Allies did not win solely because of tanks, bombers, or carriers. They won because they could mobilize and connect across continents, projecting power into jungles and mountains once thought impassable. The Jeep was a modest but indispensable cog in that machine, turning mud and distance into avenues rather than barriers. Its lesson endures. In war, technology is not just a tool but a language, a way of shaping how men perceive their own agency and their enemy's inevitability. Today, when modern armies deploy ultra-mobile command vehicles, satellite-linked squads or autonomous drones, they echo that first great leap in the Burmese mud. They echo the idea that a small, agile platform can change the tempo of an entire campaign. They echo the fear etched on the faces of defenders who watch an enemy arrive faster, strike harder and vanish before a counterattack can form. This continuity stretches from the jungles of 1944 to every theater where speed and connection define survival. As night falls on memory's stage, the image of the Jeep climbing a rain-slick ridge endures. Headlights off, driver hunched over the wheel, radio antenna slicing the mist. Behind it trudges a century of warfare, transformed by what that little vehicle taught. That in modern war the battlefield favors not the static fortress or the slow behemoth, but the node that can move, see, and speak faster than its foe. That mud can become a highway, and distance a weapon, if a force dares to reimagine its tools. And so the legacy of the Jeep is not nostalgia, but instruction. It tells every commander and every soldier that mobility without communication is wandering, and firepower without coordination is noise. It whispers a truth learned in Burma's sodden jungles. The smallest link in the chain, if multiplied and networked, can topple an empire's assumptions. The Japanese soldiers who once stared in disbelief at those climbing Jeeps glimpsed the future of war, and it was small, fast and connected. In the final reckoning, the Jeep story is less about steel and more about philosophy. It is about the triumph of integration over isolation, of speed over rigidity, of adaptability over ritual. It is about a machine that, in its modest way, helped decide the shape of a century. Its tires no longer churn Burma's mud, but its lesson rolls on. In the echo of its engines and the crackle of its radios lies a warning and a promise. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor.